Okay, so uh, Churchill says no to negotiations with Hitler, that Britain will continue fighting on. So this poses a huge problem for Adolf Hitler because what he really wants is Ukraine. He wants the western part of the Soviet Union. And as someone pointed out in class yesterday, he always thought that the British would make peace with him. He couldn't believe that they wouldn't. He thought that they were so stupid from his point of view, anyway. He thought he could negotiate with the British, but he ran into a brick wall when it came to Churchill. So he has to decide what to do. Now, remember, we're in May of June, the summer of 1940. France is about to fall. The British army has been saved. And so Hitler is not ready yet to invade the Soviet Union. That's not going to happen for another year. And so what he decides to do, or what he toys with doing, is invading Great Britain, kind of what we did to him in 1944. And he comes up with an idea, Operation Sea Lion. It never happens, but this was the name of the German plans to invade Great Britain. And the plan was to land about 160,000 German soldiers around a 40-mile stretch of southeast England, to invade England, and then to move into the English countryside, capture London, capture the major cities. And Hitler starts in the summer of 1940. He starts collecting an armada from Germany, from the newly captured countries that he's taken over: France, Belgium, the Netherlands. And he thinks about what it would take, what the logistics of an attack against Great Britain are just enormous, just enormous. And one of the key things, and the Allies would find this later, you have to have landing craft. I mean, you can get, it's kind of what's called the last mile problem. You can get your troops pretty close to the coast, but then they have to go that last mile, that last half mile to the beach itself. And ultimately, what the Allies did, they constructed a number of vessels that opened up and allowed troops to storm the beaches, but those weren't in existence yet. They're yet to be built, and I'll talk about that in later podcasts. So Hitler is facing tremendous logistical problems when he and his generals about invading Great Britain. The other thing is the German military brass wants the Royal Air Force neutralized. That they fear that this invasion would become a bloodbath if the Royal Air Force, the British Air Force, wasn't defanged, and that it was certain it was doomed to failure. And so what happens is, before Operation Sea Lion can take place, and of course it never did take place, what the Germans decide to do is try to take out the Royal Air Force. And the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, had about 2,800 aircraft stationed in France and in Belgium, Holland, and Norway. So the German Air Force has moved very close to England because of the capture of Western Europe. And it outnumbered the RAF force 4-1. But the British had some significant advantages. First of all, the British were flying from their own airfields. The Germans were close, but the British were actually flying from British airfields. The other thing is, the German fighters could only stay over England for about a half an hour before returning to their home bases. It wasn't a period in aviation history where there was enough fuel. You could put enough fuel in the plane so the plane could maintain its attack mode over Great Britain. The Germans had a very narrow window of just about half an hour in which to operate once they moved over Great Britain. The other aspect is that the British had developed early warning radar system before the war. And this turns out, and I've got some pictures of what were called the chain home. And this turned out to be absolutely essential in the ability of the Royal Air Force to survive the onslaught of the German Air Force in the Battle of Britain. What had happened is radar, and radar stands for radio detecting and ranging, had been developed in the 1930s. And the Germans also had radar, but they didn't get as deep into it. They weren't as big of believers in radar in the 1930s and even in the first part of the war, as were the British. The British really worked their technology very well and very hard when it came to radar. They invested a lot in it. And this is one of the ways where the British outfought the Germans as well as outfought the Germans. So what you had was these towers, what were called chain homes, which were stood on the coast of England, and it could peer through these radio waves. It could peer into the continent of Europe, and it could give the British Air Force, the leaders of the British Air Force, it could give them advanced warning about the approach of the German aircraft and a sense of where the German aircraft were going, and just as importantly, where the German aircraft wasn't going, because the Royal Air Force was stretched really thin. So radar was, and the use of radar by the British, the development and the use of radar, they had this infrastructure in place even before the war began, played a major role in the British victory in the Battle of Britain. Now, it wasn't perfect, the radar. One of the problems is that you had to be very, very trained to read the information, the data that you were getting, and not everybody was that well trained. The other problem is that the radar stations were often right at the coast of what they were called the chain homes, but they were where the radar towers were set up. They were often just right at the coast of England. And once the once the German Air Force flew over the chain homes, then they were useless, because it's not like today where the radar goes in a circular way and it's a 360 degree window. The radar was only looking one way. So it did offer the British an advantage. It allowed the British to stay up longer because they had a better sense of where the Germans were going. They didn't have to waste their resources. And what happened is that you have in the summer or fall of 1940, you have this tremendous air battles over Great Britain, which becomes known as the Battle of Britain. And the climax came in late August 1940. The British in that night lost 50 aircraft compared to 41 for Germany. Now, the thing for the British was it was much worse for them to lose a pilot than it was the aircraft, because they could rebuild aircraft pretty quickly, but they didn't have that many trained pilots. But in August 1940, it looked like the Germans were turning the tide. Then Hitler makes another mistake, thank God, and he orders his Air Force to stop attacking British airfields and these transmitter towers. And he orders the British or the German Air Force to start attacking British cities. And it just didn't work. There was this belief that if you attacked the British cities, you would destroy morale. You would undermine the morale of the British. The British public opinion would turn on Churchill, and they would force him to make peace. But just the opposite happens. This is what always happens when a civilian force is bombed. Look at what's going on in Ukraine. Instead, it stiffened morale of the British. It didn't weaken it; it stiffened it. Even in the intense bombing of major cities such as London, the so Hitler basically pulled the fat out of the fire for the British by changing tactics. The Luftwaffe was pretty much, some by estimates, only 2 weeks away from destroying the RAF, but then Hitler steps in, changed tactics. The Luftwaffe stops bombing airfields and towers and that kind of thing, and starts bombing cities. And what happened is this freed the RAF to control the skies again. Because they weren't getting the military infrastructure wasn't getting plastered by the Germans. The Germans had become quite effective at doing that. So the British got a breather, and ultimately, what happens is the German Air Force basically abandons its attempt to destroy the British Air Force. During this period, the Royal Air Force lost about 800 planes. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, lost about 1,400 planes. Um, so the Luftwaffe, in terms of numbers, does much more poorly than the Royal Air Force. But then again, remember, they had a 4-to-1 advantage. The Royal Air Force hangs in there sometimes by its fingernails, but ultimately, with the help of technology, with the help of the tremendous bravery and skill of the British pilots, they're able to beat back the Luftwaffe. And ultimately, Hitler decides not to invade Great Britain, and he turns his eyes towards the Soviet Union.